In 2025, police showed up at a woman's home with a message that would destroy everything she thought she knew about herself. She wasn't who she thought she was. Her name wasn't the name she'd spent her entire life using. And somewhere in Kentucky, there was a father who had been waiting more than 4 decades to see his little girl again. The woman was 46 years old. The little girl was 3 when she disappeared. And the woman standing in front of the police had no idea that she was the missing child. Her name was Michelle Newton. She just didn't know it yet. For 42 years, Michelle's family had lived with a question that had no answer. Was she still alive? Then, one ordinary day in Florida, that question was answered. But finding Michelle wasn't the first breakthrough. Because before investigators could find the little girl who vanished in 1983, they first had to find the woman who had taken her. And that woman had been living under another name for decades. This is the story of Michelle Newton, a 3-year-old girl who disappeared from Louisville, Kentucky in 1983, and a case that stayed alive long enough for the missing child to become an adult before anyone finally told her the truth. Michelle Marie Newton was born in Louisville, Kentucky in October 1979. She was the daughter of Joseph Newton and Debra Newton. And in the spring of 1983, she was 3 years old. There was nothing about Michelle's life that suggested she was about to disappear. Her father knew her as his little girl. Her family knew where she was. And her parents were preparing for a major change. They were planning to move to Georgia. But the move would not happen the way Joe expected. According to investigators, Debra told Joseph that she was going ahead to Georgia to begin a new job and prepare the family's new home. It sounded ordinary. A parent going ahead, a new job, a new house, a family preparing to start over somewhere else. But on April 2nd, 1983, Debra left Louisville with Michelle. And when Joe later arrived in Georgia, expecting to find his wife and daughter, they weren't there. Not Michelle, not Debra. No new family home waiting for them, nothing. They had disappeared. And this is where the story changes, because Joe wasn't looking for a missing child in the conventional sense. At first, he believed his daughter was with her mother. He believed he simply had to find them. But as the days turned into weeks, that assumption became harder to maintain. And eventually, investigators began treating what had happened as a custodial abduction case. A nationwide search followed. Debra was indicted for custodial interference, and an FBI unlawful flight warrant was issued. She was also listed among the FBI's top 8 most wanted parental kidnapping fugitives. But Michelle was only 3 years old, which meant something even more frightening. She was too young to understand that she was missing. She couldn't make a phone call. She couldn't tell police where she lived. She couldn't explain who she was. And if her mother successfully changed their identities, Michelle might grow up believing the disappearance had never happened. And that's exactly what investigators would eventually discover. But first, they had to spend years looking for a little girl who was getting older every day. Joe kept looking. In 1986, 3 years after Michelle disappeared, he was still talking publicly about his search. He had no certainty that his daughter was dead. And that uncertainty can be its own kind of torture. Because when someone dies, there is grief. But when someone disappears, there is always another possibility. Maybe she's alive. Maybe someone knows something. Maybe tomorrow will be the day she comes home. Joe would spend decades living inside that possibility. And then the trail went quiet. Not because Michelle had disappeared from the world. She hadn't. She was growing up somewhere, going to school, making friends, building memories, becoming a person. But the family she came from had no idea where she was. And Michelle had no idea that another family was waiting for her. By 1985, the FBI had listed Debra as a fugitive in connection with the parental kidnapping case. But the years kept moving, and eventually, the case ran into a problem that would make the search even harder. The people who had been looking for Michelle couldn't keep searching forever with the same information. The little girl in the original missing person photograph was growing into a woman, and the longer she remained missing, the less useful that 3-year-old photograph became. Then came the year that on paper looked like the end. 2000. the case was dismissed after prosecutors were unable to reach Joseph Newton. But dismissal did not mean Michelle had been found. It meant the legal case had stalled. Michelle was still gone, and her father was still waiting. If you're following this case, remember the year 2000, because this is where Michelle's story appears to disappear a second time. And what happened after that makes the eventual discovery in Florida even harder to believe. 2005. Michelle was removed from the National Missing Child Database. She was now 25 years old. The photograph of the 3-year-old girl was decades out of date. And somewhere in America, that little girl was now an adult woman, living a life she believed was her own. But investigators still didn't know where she was, and neither did the father who had been waiting for her. By 2005, Michelle Newton had been missing for 22 years. She was no longer the 3-year-old girl in the original photograph. She was 25 years old. Somewhere, she was an adult. But nobody searching for her knew where, and that created a problem that investigators could not solve with another flyer or another photograph, because if Michelle was alive, she might not even know that anyone was looking for her. Think about what that means. A missing child can grow up believing the life around her is normal, while somewhere else, another family is growing old, wondering whether she survived. That was the nightmare surrounding Michelle's case, and by this point, the people who loved her had spent decades with almost nothing to hold on to. The little girl everyone remembered was changing. Her face was changing. Her voice was changing. Her life was changing. But the case file still contained the same question. Where is Michelle Newton? The years after the disappearance were filled with searches, tips, and dead ends. But there was another problem. The longer Debra and Michelle remained missing, the easier it became for them to disappear into ordinary American life. There was no dramatic ransom demand, no body, no crime scene, no abandoned vehicle that investigators could trace to a final location. There was simply a mother and her 3-year-old daughter who had disappeared. And that meant the investigation depended heavily on information from people who might have seen them. But eventually, the calls stopped, the sightings stopped, and the headlines disappeared. For Joe Newton, however, the disappearance never became old news. It was still his daughter, still the little girl he remembered, still the child whose future he had imagined. Except now, every year that passed meant something different. Michelle wasn't 3 anymore. She wasn't 5. She wasn't 10. She wasn't 15. She was growing into adulthood, somewhere without him. Then, after decades of silence, the case received renewed attention. A family member asked the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office to take another look at the disappearance. That led retired Detective Dave Ernst to revisit the case and ultimately present evidence to a grand jury. And in 2016, Debra Newton was re-indicted in Kentucky. That mattered, because the case was no longer simply an old file sitting in an archive. There was once again an active legal effort to locate the woman investigators believed had disappeared with Michelle. But there was still one enormous problem. They didn't know where she was. Investigators had a warrant. They had a name. They had photographs. They had a history. But they didn't have Debra. And without Debra, they didn't have Michelle. The most important person in the case was still missing. Imagine being an investigator looking at that file. You know the child's name. You know her birthday. You know what she looked like at 3. You know where she disappeared from. You know who was with her. And yet, you don't know what she looks like now. You don't know what name she uses. You don't know where she lives. You don't know whether she has children of her own. You don't know what she believes about her childhood. And perhaps most importantly, you don't know whether she even knows that she is Michelle Newton. That last question would eventually become the most extraordinary part of this entire case. Because investigators weren't simply searching for a missing woman. They were searching for a woman who might not realize she was missing. Then, 2025 arrived. More than 4 decades after Michelle disappeared, the case was still unresolved. Then someone in Florida saw something. It wasn't a dramatic confession. It wasn't a DNA database alert. It wasn't a detective recognizing a face in a crowd. It was a tip. A member of the public contacted Crime Stoppers after recognizing a woman in Florida as someone who might be connected to the old Kentucky case. And suddenly, A case that had spent decades moving nowhere had somewhere to go. Florida. Investigators followed the lead to a woman living in the Villages. The woman was known in the community as Sharon Nealy. To her neighbors, she wasn't a fugitive. She wasn't a wanted woman. She was simply Sharon, a woman living a quiet life in a retirement community. But investigators believed Sharon Nealy might actually be someone else. Debra Newton, the woman who had disappeared from Louisville with her 3-year-old daughter in 1983. Investigators compared photographs. The woman in Florida appeared to resemble the woman in the old case file. But resemblance isn't proof. After 42 years, faces change, hair changes, weight changes, age changes everything. So investigators needed something stronger. They needed confirmation, and that's where Michelle's extended family became important. A DNA comparison involving Debra's sister produced a result investigators said was a 99.99% match. The woman in Florida wasn't simply a lookalike. The evidence indicated that Sharon Nealy was Debra Newton. After more than 4 decades, investigators finally knew where Michelle's mother was. But there was another question. One that was even more important. Where was Michelle? November 24, 2025, Marion County deputies approached the woman known as Sharon Nealy at her home in the Villages. The arrest was captured on body camera footage. She appeared stunned, and one of her neighbors, unaware of the decades-old history behind the police presence, could be heard referring to her as Sharon. For the neighborhood, it was an arrest. For investigators, it was the end of a 42-year search for Debra Newton. But for Michelle, the real shock was still coming. Because finding Debra was only half of the case. The missing child was still missing. Except now she wasn't 3. She was 46, and investigators knew where she was. Michelle was living her own life. She had grown up under another identity. She had memories, friends, a job, a history, everything that makes someone believe, this is who I am. Then, police came to her door. The knock on the door. She opened it, and the officers told her something that would change the meaning of almost every memory she had. According to Michelle's account, they told her, "You're not who you think you are." Then came the words that had been waiting 42 years to be spoken. "You're a missing person." And finally, "You're Michelle Marie Newton." Imagine hearing that at 46 years old. Not 3, not 5, not 10, 46. You have already lived an entire adult life, and suddenly someone tells you that another family has spent more than 4 decades searching for you. That your name is different, that your childhood isn't what you believed, that there is a father you've never known as your father, and he has been waiting for you. Michelle wasn't being told where she had been, she was being told who she was, and that distinction changes everything. For Joseph Newton, the news meant something almost impossible. The daughter he had last seen as a 3-year-old was alive. Not a photograph, not an age-progressed image, not a possibility. Alive. And after more than 4 decades, he was going to see her again. Joe later described the reunion as something he couldn't fully explain. He said she had always been in his heart, and when she walked in and he was able to put his arms around his daughter again, he said it felt like seeing her when she was first born. But there was something else that made the reunion even more remarkable. Michelle wasn't simply being reunited with a father. She was meeting an entire part of her own history for the first time. A family she had been separated from before she was old enough to understand what separation meant. You might expect anger, maybe disbelief, maybe a demand for answers. Instead, Michelle spoke about healing. She said her intention was to support both of her parents as they tried to navigate what had happened and move forward. She wanted apologies, she wanted healing, she wanted to understand. And that creates one of the strangest emotional questions in this entire case. How do you feel about a mother who raised you when you discover that she also took you away from the father who spent your entire life searching for you? There isn't a simple answer. Because Michelle isn't only the missing child in this story. She's also the adult who lived the life that came afterward. Debra Newton was brought back to Kentucky to face the legal consequences of the disappearance. Initially, she faced a felony custodial interference charge. And that created another twist, because the legal system had to confront something that had been buried underneath this case for more than 4 decades. What law applied to an act committed in 1983? The charge eventually became the subject of a plea agreement. And by 2026, the dramatic arrest that had seemed like the final chapter turned out not to be the final chapter at all. Debra ultimately pleaded guilty to misdemeanor custodial interference. On May 15, 2026, she was sentenced to 2 years of probation, with a 1-year suspended prison sentence if she violated probation or encountered further legal trouble. So after 42 years, there was an arrest, a reunion, a confession of guilt through a plea, and then probation. But perhaps the most important outcome of the case didn't happen inside a courtroom. It happened on a porch, between a father and the daughter he had lost when she was 3. There's a temptation with cases like this to say, Michelle was found. And technically, she was. But that phrase doesn't really capture what happened. Because Michelle wasn't found as a 3-year-old. She was found as a 46-year-old woman. A woman with her own memories, her own identity, her own life. And the discovery didn't give her childhood back. It gave her something else. The truth. For Joseph Newton, the truth meant finally knowing his daughter was alive. For investigators, it meant closing a case that had survived 4 decades. For Michelle, it meant discovering that the person she had always believed herself to be was only part of the story. And maybe that's the most unsettling part. The missing child had never stopped existing. She had simply grown up somewhere no one was looking. For 42 years, Michelle Newton existed in 2 worlds without knowing it. The world where she was living, and the world where people were still searching for her. And sometimes, the most difficult cold cases aren't the ones where nobody knows what happened. They're the ones where someone knows the truth, and the person at the center of the mystery doesn't. And that's where we'll pick up next, because there's still one question we haven't answered. How did Michelle spend 42 years without knowing she was the missing child investigators were looking for?